The blizzard came without warning, howling winds swallowing the small mountain town of Haven Creek like a beast breathing frost and fury. By nightfall, the roads disappeared beneath mountains of snow, power lines crackled and died, and the world turned white and still. But out in that storm, crawling through the blinding snowdrifts, was a man half frozen, bleeding and desperate. His motorcycle lay twisted in the ditch behind him, its chrome bones swallowed by snow. His leather jacket bore the insignia of the Hells Angels, a mark that usually made people step aside in fear. But tonight, no one saw him except for the storm, and one old woman who refused to let another soul die outside her door. Before we go further into this story of compassion and redemption, take a moment. If you believe in kindness and second chances, and in the goodness that still exists in this world, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps stories like this one reach hearts that need them most. The woman's name was Mabel Carter, 72 years old, a retired school teacher who lived alone in a wooden cabin tucked beneath tall pines at the edge of Haven Creek. Her husband had passed away 5 winters earlier, and her children were scattered across different states, too busy to visit. Her days were quiet, filled with knitting, tea, and the sound of wind brushing the trees outside her frosted window panes. That night, when the storm hit, Mabel had stoked her fire high and settled in for what she expected would be another lonely evening. But then came the knock. Faint at first, then a desperate pounding that made her heart leap. She grabbed her shawl and opened the door against the roaring wind. And there he was, a man built like a wall, slumped against her porch railing, his face streaked with blood and snow, a bandana barely clinging to his head. His leather jacket was torn, his hands trembling. Mabel gasped but didn't hesitate. She reached out, hooked her frail arm under his, and somehow managed to pull him inside. His boots dragged snow across her floor, his breath ragged and harsh. She didn't know who he was or what he'd done, but she knew this much. No one deserved to die alone in the cold. She laid him near the fire, stripped off his jacket, and saw the bruises and gashes covering his arms. There was a stitched tattoo of an angel on his forearm, black wings spread wide with the words, "Ride free," beneath it. Mabel fetched warm water, bandages, and an old medical kit her husband once kept. She cleaned his wounds, fed him spoonfuls of hot soup, and waited as color slowly returned to his face. When he finally opened his eyes, confusion flickered there, then disbelief. He looked around the cabin like he couldn't understand where he was. For hours, Mabel said nothing. She just worked quietly, letting the crackling fire speak for her. Only when he whispered a hoarse thank you did she smile and nod. His name, he later told her, was Jack, or Jax as his brothers called him. He was part of a motorcycle club that often made headlines for all the wrong reasons. He'd been on his way back from a funeral when his bike hit black ice. He didn't remember much after that, only the sound of wind and the sight of headlights fading into the white storm. Mabel didn't ask questions about his club or his past. She only saw a man broken, both inside and out. She told him he could stay until the storm passed. And so, for the next 3 days, the unlikely pair shared her little cabin while the world outside remained frozen. At first, Jax barely spoke, his rough hands twitching from pain or memory. But gradually, the silence between them softened. Mabel would hum while she cooked. He'd listen, sometimes with his eyes closed, as if the tune carried him somewhere far from the violence and noise he knew. He told her bits and pieces about his life, the endless roads, the fights, the brotherhood that was all he had since his parents died when he was young. He spoke of mistakes, of people he'd hurt and couldn't forgive himself for. Mabel didn't judge him. She only told him something her late husband used to say, "Even the dirtiest hands can plant good seeds if the heart decides to change." It struck Jax harder than he expected. No one had ever spoken to him like that, without fear, without anger. He began to help her around the house, chopping wood, fixing the squeaky hinge on her door, even shoveling snow once the storm eased. When the power finally came back, Jax had already made up his mind to leave quietly, not wanting to bring trouble to her doorstep. But that's when things took a turn no one in Haven Creek could have predicted. On the morning he planned to leave, a convoy of black pickup trucks rolled into town, rival bikers looking for Jax. They'd been tracking him after a bar fight days before the crash, one that ended with serious injuries and bad blood. The sheriff's office warned townsfolk to stay indoors, but word spread fast. A Hell's Angel was hiding in town, and for some reason people started whispering Mabel's name. By noon, her quiet cabin was surrounded by flashing lights and snow-caked boots. The sheriff knocked firmly, calling her name. Inside, Mabel sat by the fire, her hands folded calm as ever. Jack stood near the window, torn between guilt and rage. He told her he'd surrender, that he wouldn't let her pay for helping a man like him. But Mabel shook her head slowly. "You came here broken," she said, "and God doesn't send the broken to us for nothing." When the door opened, she stepped out first, a small, gray-haired woman facing men with badges and suspicion in their eyes. She told them Jax wasn't a danger anymore, that he'd nearly died and she'd only done what any decent soul would do. The sheriff, a man who'd known Mabel since childhood, hesitated. The rival bikers stood by, angry and cold, waiting for a chance to grab him. And then something unexpected happened. People from the town began to gather. They'd heard about what Mabel had done, how she'd saved a man's life in the worst blizzard in a decade. Some remembered how she'd taught their children, others how she'd cared for the sick after her husband died. They didn't see a biker or a criminal anymore. They saw a wounded man standing behind the same woman who'd always helped others without asking for anything in return. The sheriff finally lowered his voice and said, "Let's hear him out." Jack stepped forward, snow crunching under his boots. He didn't defend himself with excuses. He simply said he'd made mistakes, too many, but that the old woman behind him had reminded him of something he thought he'd lost, his humanity. He said if she could forgive him without knowing him, maybe he could start forgiving himself. The silence that followed was heavy and strange, like the world was holding its breath. The sheriff nodded, saying they'd handle things by the book, but not with violence. The rival bikers eventually drove off, muttering curses, realizing the town wasn't on their side. And as the engines faded, the snow began to fall again, gently this time, as if the storm itself had softened. For days after, Haven Creek buzzed with talk. Some couldn't believe that the town's elderly widow had harbored a Hell's Angel, but others saw something deeper in it, a lesson about mercy, courage, and seeing beyond appearances. Local newspapers picked up the story. "Teacher shelters outlaw in blizzard. Town learns power of compassion," the headline read. And soon, donations started pouring into Mabel's name. Food drives, charity efforts, and even a new community shelter, built in honor of what they called the Winter of Grace. Jax was taken in for questioning, but later released after the sheriff confirmed his actions weren't premeditated violence. Before leaving town, he returned to Mabel's cabin one last time. He'd shaved, cleaned up, and looked like a different man, still rough but lighter somehow. He handed her a worn leather patch from his jacket, the one bearing the wings of his club. "I'm not riding with them anymore," he told her softly. "You showed me a different road." Mabel took the patch with trembling hands and smiled. "Keep riding," she said, "just in a better direction." He left that morning with a small duffel bag and a promise to come back when the snow melted. True to his word, months later, when spring touched Haven Creek with green again, a motorcycle engine echoed up the mountain road. The people who once feared that sound now smiled. Jax returned, not as a Hell's Angel, but as Jack Carter, volunteer and mechanic at the new community shelter built in Mabel's honor. Together, they turned her little act of compassion into something far greater. The shelter became a place for lost souls, veterans, drifters, people who'd fallen through the cracks. Jack fixed their bikes, Mabel cooked their meals, and both listened to their stories. It was as if the storm that once nearly killed him had been the very thing that saved them both. And so, the town that once whispered in judgment now spoke in awe. The old woman who'd opened her door to a stranger had changed not just one life, but many. She'd reminded everyone in Haven Creek and far beyond, that kindness still had the power to rewrite a man's story, even one written in scars and regret. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in forgiveness, second chances, and the simple courage of doing what's right, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more stories that restore faith in humanity. And before we end, here's a special request. Comment below with the words, "Kindness still wins." If you believe that no matter how cold the world gets, there's always someone willing to open the door. Because sometimes, the smallest fire of compassion can melt even the deepest snow.